welcome to number 18, home of Healthy and Happy in Camglen Radio, to this, the first of two special author events supported by the Year of Stories 2022 Community Fund. We're live on YouTube, or you may be watching this later, or you could be listening on Camglen Radio. If you're watching live, you are very welcome to put your questions and we'll try to incorporate them into our discussion this evening. 2022 has been designated Scotland's Year of Stories. This is a year in which stories inspired by, created or written in Scotland will be showcased and celebrated, and in this event is no different. Our love of stories is hardwired into all of us and is the strongest way to connect with each other. My name's Kat Gibson, I'm your host for the event and I present the Lunchtime Wednesday show here in Camglen from tomorrow 11 AM. The author beside me has written a huge number of titles and is one of the leading proponents of Tartan Noir. He was a journalist and is certainly no stranger to the written word. He's even been to Glastonbury. Audience, can you please welcome our special guest, Mr. Christopher Brookmyre. Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You're here to talk about the Year of Stories and what stories mean to you, and of course about your new book, The Cliff House. Are you going to be doing a little reading for us as well?
Yeah, if I might be tempted.
Oh,
we might have to contextualise it a wee bit so we don't confuse everybody.
So before we get into that, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you started writing?
God, this goes right back, way back. I mean, I started writing pretty much from when I could write sentences. I was writing stories. I remember being probably about primary 2 onwards, and I think just that impulse, I don't know if it was just hardwired, that as soon as I read a story that I found exciting, I wanted to create something like that. Mm-hmm. So I remember from early days in primary school just being inspired by various things that had hit me, whether it was reading Asterix books or anything that I could get my hands on. I recall round about, must have been about primary 4, so it would have been 1976, going to see Jaws, and then writing lots of stories involving people getting eaten by sharks. So there was a sort of impulse of seeing something that I found exciting and thinking, I want to create that. So it continued all through school. I mean, I think secondary school was when it really, I felt I had more of a vehicle for it, because you get an essay assignment more regularly in English, and actually what I remember was all through like first, second, third year at English, there would be you could always get this essay assignment and you could choose one of 3 things. You could write a descriptive essay, an argumentative essay, or a short story, and I always wrote the short story, except there was one time I wanted something off my chest, so I wrote the argumentative essay and a short story, because I always wanted to write a story. Although so many of my classmates, they always chose what they obviously figured was the easy one, which was a descriptive essay, and for some reason they always wrote about going to the baths. I think Barhead Leisure Centre was just the most described facility in all of Renfrewshire, and the assignment would be that the minimum you'd to write was like 1 page of A4, and so they would write in as large handwriting as they could possibly get away with, and space out the words just to hit that minimum. And I was completely the opposite. I around about 3rd year, I got and I don't know where I got this notepad, but it was longer than A4, and the lines were closer together than standard, so I could fit a lot of text on this thing. And I would write on average 6 to 8 pages of this thing in as small handwriting as I could manage. I used to save the assignment for a Sunday night, and after dinner I'd go up there and just spend 3 or 4 hours writing some supposed to be short story, not that short. And I remember my mum actually, because she was a teacher, saying, you maybe should run this past your English teacher, because word for word it's the equivalent of maybe her having to mark about 10 more essays because of the sheer volume of it. And that hadn't even occurred to me, so I did go and ask my English teacher and said, is this okay, because my mother has raised this issue, and she said, actually I keep yours to the end so I've got something to look forward to. And that, you can't put a value on how inspirational that is as a kid. You feel like you've got something that somebody whose opinion you value has endorsed. So I would be, that it just made me even more enthusiastic for every time there was an essay question. Although it did get me into trouble. In round about fourth year, I think, as I say, I was quite derivative in terms of I would write about whatever I'd seen or whatever I'd been reading. And I was watching lots of horror movies, and I was reading things like Ian Fleming and Robert Ludlum and lots of kind of Cold War spy thrillers and stuff. And then I'd have to come and write a short story in which I wasn't allowed to swear. And this struck me as extremely unrealistic, that you've created characters in the absolute heat of their most dire circumstance and they're not allowed to swear. And so I remember feeling quite frustrated by this because I was allowed to express myself in so many other ways. And also it struck me as utterly bizarre that it was okay for me to write about decapitation and disembowelment, but, heaven forfend, somebody should say fuck. So I said to my English teacher, look, I didn't tell her I was doing it in advance. I said, I've written 2 versions of this essay just to drive the point home. And it shows you what a pig-headed wee bastard I must have been because I wrote out longhand 2 versions of these 6 pages or 8 pages of this. And one of them had the way I wanted it to read and the other was the censored version. And she just discarded the censored version right away. She took my point. She went away and she said, that's actually the best essay you've written, the best story you've written. Can I hang on to it? I want to show this to the head of the department. And this is a little lesson in choosing your words carefully. She gave it to the head of the department and said, I think you should take a look at this. Not, I think you should take a look at this, it's very good. Just, I think you should take a look at this. So she gets this essay that's full of swearing and also had a reference to necrophilia in it, which did not go down a bomb in a Catholic secondary school in Barhead.
No, I'm sure it did.
So I get kind of carpeted by the head of the department who's like, and she was sort of saying, other kids have heard about this and they're all talking about how they're going to fill their stories with swearing and where will it end? And I was thinking, right, so for the first time in this school's history, you've got all these kids talking about how they're looking forward to writing their next short story and you think this is a bad thing. But no, so I got carpeted for it. I'll bet you to this day she's telling everybody that she was massively encouraging of my work. But what I also remember was my English teacher said, with regards to this wee controversy, said, the only problem with you is that you do kind of tend to lose all sense of responsibility when you've got a pen in your hand.
Yeah, I noticed that you do swear an awful lot in your books. I mean, as somebody else who said their mother is a teacher, let me tell you, that would never have been allowed. So why do you use that? Why do you feel that's important?
It's not so much that I've seen it's important, of not really recognising why people think it's important not to. I've always just wanted to reflect the language of the characters I create, and it's not about deciding that I'm going to put that language into a story for shock value. God help us. It's more like, I mean, a good example would be that when I wrote a book called All Fun and Games Until Somebody Loses an Eye, and there's not a lot of swearing in that one because most of the characters have English as their second language. Right. So it wouldn't be right for them to swear quite as much or to use colloquialisms. And whereas at the other end of the scale, I wrote a book called A Tale Etched in Blood and Hard Black Pencil, which is all about school. It follows a bunch of characters from their first day in primary one all the way through to their leaving dance at the end of secondary school, because there's a murder happens sort of 20 odd years later, and you go back in time with them and see their school days, and through seeing their school days you start to work out who done it and why. But that was the sweariest book I've ever written because I was writing about school kids, and school kids swear far more than they need to because it's like a new toy. There's also a kind of language power relationship where if you've got, the new cool word for something or the new swear word, and I wanted to reflect that. So it would be absurd to me to censor that because of someone else's sensibilities. And it's weird. People do have these kind of weird hang-ups about it. I wrote... I remember actually, I wrote a radio play for the BBC, and it was an adaptation of a short story. It was
I think I've heard this story.
It was a 1 hour radio play, and I submitted the first draft of it, and the producer said, "Are you aware you've used the word fuck 40 times?" And I was like, "Is that a lot?" And they said, "Yes, we can let you have 15." Which blew my mind because they clearly thought there was people out there who would tolerate 15 instances of the word fuck, and on number 16 they'd be like, "This is filth." And, so yeah, I had to change it and change until I got the magic number. Then we came to record it, and Douglas Henshaw was playing the lead, and he said, "There's a line in this that doesn't work the way it's been cleaned up. It needs fuck in there." So, and I said, "That's no bother. Surely I can just borrow a fuck from page 25 and change something on page 14." Just as I said, no, that we still have to run it up the line, because the BBC not only have to approve the number of instances, they also have to approve the context, which kind of seemed crazy for me. It's like they don't want you saying fuck frivolously. And also maybe I think they were worried that writers would get in touch with each other and say, "Have you any fucks left over from that thing you wrote?" Because then they're going to say, I'm sorry mate, I'd like to help, I literally couldn't give a fuck. And also I was talking about this to an audience the other day. What's really bizarre is that on Radio Scotland for many years you couldn't say the word shite until after 9 o'clock, until the late 90s. And since then you've been allowed to, and the reason for that is simply that Celtic signed a player called Raphael Philippe Shite. And his name was spelled S-H-E-I-D-T. And I mean, I know this is a weird thing to fixate upon, but I remember at the time thinking, this is going to be interesting to see how this plays out. The pundits were all saying, "Oh, is it pronounced shed or shide or whatever?" hoping that they'd say yes, and he was insistent, "No, it's pronounced shite." And so you were at this utterly absurd situation, which I was waiting for something like this to precipitate, where essentially the censorship rules are saying you can make the same phonetic sound to tell us what this man is called, you just can't use the same sound to tell us how he's playing. So ever since, I think they kind of realised that was absurd, and they stopped it. But it's a strange thing, that the attitude to it. I do a lot of events with Mark Billingham, and as he always says, it strikes him as weird that people pick up a crime novel and they go, "Oh, all my favourites, kidnapping, murder, rape, child abuse. Oh, swearing, heavens no." It just. So to me, it's always been about reflecting how people think. I think you want to show how a character thinks, how a character views the world. And also, I'll be perfectly honest about it, there's times, especially in the west of Scotland, when swearing is brilliantly deployed for humorous effect. So, that is not something I'm going to give up on easily.
How do you get your inspiration for your books? Are you permanently one of these people who've got a notebook that you're constantly writing down characters, mannerisms, events?
These days, if I have ideas that might form a story, I will take a note of that in case I forget. But I think most of the time, you're not aware of the things you're taking in at the time you're taking them in. I think you file things away, but writers are all magpies. We all we encounter some shiny thing, and put it in the back of our mind, but we might not know when it'll appear. I think I'm sort of constantly absorbing whatever it is culturally or politically, and it's not that I think, "Oh, that would make a good story." It's more like something just kind of gets under your skin, and you think, "Well," I think like with the Cliff House, it largely came from the pandemic. I noticed actually there's several novels came out this summer that were all about parties or sort of gatherings in remote places. And I think you had a bunch of writers at the same time over the last 2 years not getting to go to any parties. And so end up thinking about parties, thinking about gatherings, thinking about your relationships with your friends. And so something like that comes along, and the thing you're thinking about inevitably can become the story you're going to write. Not always. I did an event years ago with a neuroscientist. It was part of the Edinburgh Film Festival, and the neuroscientist was there to talk about how we get ideas and how we develop them. And he said it's kind of a myth, this notion that you suddenly have this spark of an idea. You have this moment of inspiration. He said that actually you're having ideas all the time. But what happens is you reject most of them because they're not relevant to what you're thinking about. But once you start thinking about one thing, there's a kind of accretion process where if you've started thinking about an idea and something else sparks up in your mind, you think, "Oh, that sticks," and that builds and builds. And by the time you've written the book, you cannot remember what it was that gave you the idea in the first place. Or you certainly can't remember all the many pieces that came together to create the idea. Sometimes it is quite obvious, that I wrote a book called Attack of the Unsinkable Rubber Ducks, and it was all about psychics and mediums, and it was because I'd read so many books about investigating the paranormal and investigating supernatural claims, and I was fascinated by that, and I was fascinated by stage magic, and I just read books about it because it was an interesting subject to me. And it wasn't that I thought, well, I'll write a book about that, I better research it. It was more that I'd read all this stuff and I suddenly thought, there's a crime novel in here, because the dynamic's exactly the same of someone investigating any crime. They're trying to find out how somebody's trying to deceive everybody. And that's the same with paranormal and supernatural investigations, is always trying to find out how somebody is deceiving everybody and essentially claiming to have paranormal or supernatural powers.
So you were saying at the beginning there about the plot of Cliff House, and about the hen weekend and disappearing off to a Hebridean island or to have this. So tell us a little bit more about it, because Scotsman says it's a bit Agatha Christie-like.
It is. I mean, it's about 7 women on a hen weekend to it's an island just south of Barra where there isn't one. Because I didn't want the emails, telling me everything that I'd got wrong, from the geography to the flora and fauna. And it's in the kind of Airbnb era. They've got this very, very tasty place that's usually a kind of A-list Instagram celebs would go to, but they've got a cancellation. And it's essentially a private island because it's the only house really on the island. So they've got the chance to go there for this hen weekend, and as part of the A-list feel to it is that you get helicoptered in, and then the helicopter's not back for 72 hours. So they've got the island to themselves, or so they think. And it's also about the fact that when you talk about the idea of a hen weekend or any kind of party, when you first conceive of it, you think it's going to be fantastic because I'm going to invite all the people I like most. And then you realise, if I invite her, it means I can't invite her. If I invite her, it means I definitely have to invite her, even though I don't want to invite her. And that politics starts to get into it. And that's what has happened in this case. It's a woman called Jen, who's getting married for the second time. She's in her early 40s. Her kids have grown up. And her first marriage was terrible. She was married to a mentally and physically abusive individual who's now dead. But he damaged her so that she kind of finds it hard to believe she can be happy. So she's engaged to someone he's younger than her, he's good looking, he's charming, he's kind, but part of her won't let her believe it's true. She thinks that it's too good to be true and he must be working some agenda, because the story's all about trust. So she decides she's going to have a hen weekend, even though she's not sure about whether the marriage is actually going to go ahead. Because and I suppose during lockdown I was thinking about these levels of relationship you have with people and who you trust. So Jen has got people she's invited that she doesn't know that well, but she sees all the time, because that was something else that hit me about lockdown. You ended up spending time, obviously not just with family, but maybe because your whole world became smaller, the people you would see a lot of might not necessarily be the people you knew that well. And I thought about the fact that there's people you might see all the time and you might enjoy their company, but you realise you don't really know an awful lot about them. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's people you've known all your life, and even if you don't see them for 10 years, when you run into them again, it's like you never skipped a beat. But I thought, if you're on an island with people and there's an element of danger, where's the greatest danger coming from? Is it someone who you've brought there and you realise you don't know much about? Or is it actually, are you more vulnerable to someone you've brought who knows everything about you? So I was wanting to think about those different levels of friendship. And so Jen has invited like people she plays tennis with, because she sees them all the time, but she realises she doesn't know them that well. But she's also invited to the best friends that she had at primary school, or she's known all through from like primary 1. But even that's awkward, because they're called Helena and Michelle, and they were each other's best friends from a very early age, all through secondary school, and then they formed a band and they had a couple of hits. But then when things were starting to get ropey, Michelle got the offer to go solo, and she dumped the rest of the band, became massively successful, and Helena hasn't spoken to her in 17 years because of this, and they're both on the hen weekend. It's these kind of things that you're going to end up with that are far from the fantasy of the gathering you were going to get. And she's also had to invite Beattie, which is her late husband's big sister, And she's one of those big sisters that refuses to believe anything bad about her wee brother, including all the stuff that came out in court about her wee brother. And then at the other end of that spectrum, she's been forced to invite her future sister-in-law, who she's never met. Her future sister-in-law is called Samira, but poor Samira had twins 6 months ago and hasn't been out of the house since. And her fiancé has said, please invite her along just to get her a wee break. So she's invited someone she's never met. She's invited someone that doesn't like her. She's invited 2 other people that hate each other. And just add alcohol. And
I think at that point we'll get you to read a wee bit then.
Yeah. She's also there's got a friend called Nicolette that she only knows from playing tennis, but also she's got an insurance policy in that she's invited her tennis coach, Kennedy. And Kennedy is younger by about 10 or 12 years than most of the women there. But it's Kennedy's superpower is she's one of those people who can make everybody get along. And Jen thought, I'll invite Kennedy because that'll make sure that everybody keeps the peace. I should also point out 2 things. One, I was 10,000 words into this before I realised that it was Jen the hen. And and the other thing is that Michelle, as I said, has been massively successful, but that's come at a cost because recently she had her cloud hacked and a sex tape has been leaked, so she's been feeling rather vulnerable as a result. So I'm going to read, this is from Kennedy's point of view. As I said, they've got the island to themselves, except they've exercised the right to have a private chef who's also a gifted mixologist, and so he's supplied all these cocktails. Now, they get flown in the Friday night, and I know in these kind of stories it's people talk about a slow burn. They're there all weekend and it gradually deteriorates, so by Sunday night, everybody's at each other's throats, but this is Scotland, so it's like the Friday night and they're already absolutely bloated. They've all hit the cocktails very hard and the food hasn't arrived yet, and tempers are getting frayed because everybody's starting to tell the truth. Right, as I say, this is from Kennedy's point of view. Kennedy noticed Jen checking her watch, no doubt wondering when they were getting the call for dinner. So tell me, Michelle, said Nicolette, which movie about the music business would you say is the most accurate? I can't say any of them's particularly accurate. My favourite is still The Bodyguard, probably because of the age I was when I first saw it. Jen and Helena and I must have watched it 100 times back then. My favourite is Almost Famous, said Samira. All that tension between the singer and the guitarist over which one is the star. Kennedy could feel the temperature drop a notch as Samira spoke. She wondered if she was oblivious of the parallel or squiffy enough to think this was funny. I haven't seen it, said Michelle diplomatically. Oh, you've got to, Samira insisted. The best bit is this scene on a private plane in a storm where all their secrets and confessions spill out because they think they're going to die. I think Michelle's had enough secrets spill out, said Nicolette, which felt like the record scratch moment of the evening so far. Michelle got to her feet. Kennedy assumed she was going for the door, but she stopped at the sideboard and grabbed another drink. It's okay, Michelle said. It is kind of the elephant in the room. In fact, that's the whole thing about my sex tape. It's always there. Everybody knows. Jen walked across to clasp Michelle's hand. She'd evidently decided it would help Michelle to talk about something happier, and so asked her about her new album. They stayed over by the sideboard as though Michelle wasn't ready to rejoin the body of the Kirk. Alongside Kennedy, Helena spoke in a quiet voice, almost but not quite under her breath. I told you. It didn't take long for it all to be about her. Kennedy could only just make out what Michelle was saying to Jen now, which reassured her that Helena's quieter words would not be audible across the room. They were audible to herself, Beattie and Samira, though. She's been through something truly terrible, Kennedy countered. It was weird seeing this side to Helena, normally so sympathetic. She's got a new album coming out and a tour in the offing. Always check the context. Drama means column inches, means clicks, likes, follows, ticket sales. Are you saying you think she leaked the sex tape herself? Kennedy asked. Helena looked a little cowed at having been called on this. I wouldn't be the first to suggest it if I was, she said, not quite backing down. She was definitely a bit pissed, though not as much as Samira, it had to be said, who was starting to look woozy. Are you okay? Kennedy asked her. I'm feeling no pain, Samira replied, over loud. I haven't felt this good in fucking ages. Kennedy detected a slight wince from Beattie at the swear word, While Samira's volume alone caused Jen to look up from her private chat with Michelle. Just maybe slow it down a wee bit so you can make the most of your weekend of freedom, Jen suggested. You don't want to waste tomorrow feeling rough. That's a fair point, Samira conceded. I've just been so enslaved by these two minuscule tyrants. Everybody lies about motherhood, and nobody tells you how fucking boring it's going to be. Beatty's expression of sour disapproval worsened. Kennedy inferred that she found the sentiment more profane than the language. All they do is cry, Samira went on. The only evening since they were born that I've had any peace was after they had their MMR. While their bodies were dealing with that, it seemed to chill them out for some reason. It was bliss. Nicolette's eyes widened at this. I wouldn't be so sanguine if having the MMR vaccine knocked them for 6, she said. Why? Because it's dangerous. There's all kinds of side effects. It's all about the money for the pharma companies, so they lie about everything. So you didn't have the COVID vaccine, Samira asked. Well, yes, obviously, but that was my risk to take. And okay, I don't have kids of my own, but I'm just saying, if I did, I wouldn't take the risk on their behalf. You'd suggest that instead I take the risk of them getting measles, mumps, or rubella. Fucking polio, maybe. It's as well you don't have kids then, because they wouldn't stand a chance if they were being raised by a fucking stupid cow. Jen's intake of breath was audible as Samira got up onto unsteady feet. I'm sorry, I need to get some air, Samira said, and headed out the door. Kennedy spotted a tear in Nicolette's eye, which she quickly wiped from view. There was no need for that, Nicolette said, wounded. Maybe you should have kept your conspiracy theories to yourself on this occasion, Nicolette, said Jen. She's utterly shit-faced, totally off her tits, Nicolette argued, out of control. I think we should leave this, Jen told her, especially as she's no longer here to speak for herself. Beatty gave a bitter chuckle. That never stopped you when it came to Jason, did it? She said, eyeing Jen. What's that supposed to mean? I'm saying the world has only ever heard your version of events. I'm not sure how Jason's version of how he murdered Ronnie Bryceland would make it sound any better than it did in court, but the floor is yours if you'd like to speak in his behalf. I think everybody needs to chill, Michelle said. Let's all dial down the aggro factor a notch. We could do with some food, Kennedy suggested. Michelle glanced at her watch. Damn good point, she said. I'm going to find out what the hell's happening with the dinner. Everybody try to play nice in the meantime. Kennedy's right, Helena said once Michelle had gone. Everybody's drinking on an empty stomach and getting hangry, so let's not take anything to heart. We need to remember why we're all here. We came to have a good time. We came for a celebration. That was when they heard Michelle scream. And then I should say what happens after that is one of them goes missing. And then the rest of them get a message on their phone with a video showing the missing woman in a rather precarious circumstance. And they're told that she's going to die unless one of them confesses to the terrible thing she's done, but doesn't say which one. And they've all done something.
It's like an episode of Maths, isn't it?
Episode of what?
Maths, Married at First Sight. Have you not seen that?
No. But you were saying, drawing the Agatha Christie comparison, and that's fair enough, because it's. I realised when I was coming up with the idea that it has a lot of comparison to And Then There Were None.
Yeah.
And Then There Were None, there's like all these people invited to an island where they're going to be picked off one by one. But the thing that struck me about And Then There Were None is that it's very literally unforgiving. It's a story about retribution. I actually had a bit of a problem with it, morally speaking, because And Then There Were None, you're essentially asked to condone extrajudicial murder, to say that all these people who've got a secret all deserve to die because of the thing they've never been punished for. So it's literally it's literally unforgiving, and it's about retribution. And I wanted to write the opposite of that. I wanted to write a book about forgiveness, about people who've all done something wrong. They've all hurt somebody, and in a lot of cases they've hurt somebody else who's there in the island. But the way to get out of their situation is they have to forgive themselves. They have to forgive each other, but they have to forgive themselves personally, because I guess they're realising that the thing that they're carrying guilt for is also kind of holding them back. You know, and I think this came out of the pandemic, of me thinking of the friends that you don't see, and how the wee grudges and niggles in between you all kind of faded away when you thought people are so valuable to us. What's really important is each other's company, and so it is a story about people who have hurt each other and have been hurt by what they're carrying around, but it's about them learning to get past that in order to get out alive.
Mm. It's slightly different take from what you normally write, because of course you're normally assumed with tartan noir, and I was going to ask you, well, what do you think tartan noir means?
The first thing I'd say about it is it's chromatically impossible, because if it's noir, it's black and it can't be tartan. Although I think I'm probably appropriate to be described as tartan noir, because I don't think of myself as noir. I'm more tartan than noir, because I think what I write is more colourful than noir. And noir to me has connotations of being quite bleak in its outlook, and very pessimistic. I like happy endings, and I like there to be a kind of redemption story, and I like there to be this sort of possibility of redemption. And this is a good example because it's quite an uplifting story ultimately. I think tartan noir, though, is a useful term in that it's a term that kind of illustrates how rich we are for a variety of crime fiction in Scotland, because it's a helpful umbrella term to cover such a multiplicity of different subgenres, and there's everything that you could possibly think of in Scotland. There's a crime fiction novel covering it, whether it's different regions, whether it's from urban to rural, whether it's historical to science fiction, whether it's cosy crime fiction to really cutting edge, dark, horrific crime fiction. So, and also, I wouldn't ever shrug off the term tartan noir, because it's anything that helps people find other books that they'd enjoy. That's what's really useful about it.
Well, of course, there's the Bloody Scotland, which is the whole festival that's sort of designed for crime writers in Scotland to go and talk about their books in Stirling.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's 10 years now, Bloody Scotland's been going on, and again, that shows the kind of affection we have in Scotland for our crime fiction. The great thing about Bloody Scotland is there's lots of book festivals, there's lots of even crime fiction festivals where you can go and hear writers talk about their work, but the good thing about Bloody Scotland is it puts the writers in quite unusual contexts, as well as the normal events. There's things like music, and there's things like quizzes, and even five-a-sides. So Scotland versus England five-a-side match every year, with various crime writers trying to avoid a coronary as they wander around the five-a-side pitch. So if you ever want to see Ian Rankin looking like he's about to die, he didn't play this year though. But and actually the first year we did it, it was like ended up being kind of Scotland versus the rest of the world, because England had brought in just kind of boost the numbers. They had Icelandics and Swedes and Americans and Canadians, but I think the only crime writers would do something like that at a festival, because we don't tend to take ourselves very seriously. I can't really see the sort of literature with a capital L novelists lining up to humiliate themselves and quite so readily.
I was going to ask you about the books that you write with your wife, about Ambrose Parry, and how does that dynamic work? And who makes the dinner? It's an evolving process, it would be safe to say. I'm editing.
Well, we first had the idea of writing together probably about, must be about 2014, 2015, round about then, because my wife went back and was an anaesthetist, and she went back and did a master's at Glasgow in the history of medicine. And it was when she was doing that she her dissertation was on James Young Simpson. She had a medical background, so she had never done any kind of arts and humanities at undergraduate level, so she's suddenly in like tutorial groups with folk who've all just done their history degree. And I remember her saying to me that it suddenly struck her that the only way she was going to look remotely impressive in this tutorial group was if somebody had a heart attack. That she'd be the one that knew what to do. But she then, because she was needing a bit of a kind of comfort zone, she decided she would do her dissertation on James Young Simpson, who was kind of the father of anaesthetics, essentially, because he was the person who discovered the anaesthetic properties of chloroform. And so we started talking about when she told me more and more about James Young Simpson and his life and what kind of character he was, I thought, I can't believe nobody's written a novel about him and about his discovery and about that period of medical innovation in Edinburgh. So it wasn't something, I think we said we should do it together, but I think maybe we envisaged that she would research and come up with some ideas and then I would write a novel, and we came to realise that wasn't going to work. That you can't just give somebody a big slab of research and say, please find something in there. And the fact that she had worked for 20 years as an anaesthetist and also the perspective on this as a woman in medicine meant there was story ideas that she was going to see that I was never going to come up with. So we decided we would try and write it together. So it has been a kind of ongoing process of us learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, and that has continued. We've now written 4 Ambrose Parry novels, and we've also been working together to write for television as well. Not just Ambrose Parry, but we're adapting my last novel, The Cut, into a 4-part series. So we've kind of, that process has evolved all the time. You know, we keep finding new ways to be more efficient or better ways to get on with each other creatively, because we do approach it in different ways. I think I'm always someone who's excited by the possibilities of where a story might take me that day that I didn't know it was going to take me the day before. And Marissa doesn't really like to be quite so surprised that way. You know, she's an anaesthetic background. Going into work in the operating theatre, you don't want there to be something you didn't anticipate, you know, and you kind of go in and say, let's just see how this goes. So she's more inclined to plan things in advance, and I'm more inclined to see, well, here's the idea, let's see where the idea takes us. And we've kind of had to compromise or at least work out ways to make the best of each other's perspective on that. So, which basically means that we plan everything now.
You tend to use Scottish cities a lot in your books, and of course this is no different. You've set this on a Scottish island, even if you did make it up. Why do you think that the whole grounding in Scotland is so important, and in particular Aberdeen and Glasgow?
I think, for one thing, my natural inclination is to write what I know, but also I think I grew up being inspired by stories from all different places. But probably through my teen years, seeing like the American action movies that I liked, or and American crime novels that I liked, and I loved that sense of scale and high stakes and how exciting they were. And I thought, why aren't we seeing these stories with Scottish backdrops? And whether that's the backdrop of our cities and our landscape, or the backdrop of our culture and our language. Because I always thought that, especially the west of Scotland, we've got this kind of, not just a sort of rich dialect and rich slang and humour, but there's an attitude inherent in what we write and how we speak. So I wanted to kind of combine the type of story that excited me with Scottish dialect, Scottish characters, and a Scottish perspective on it as well. So it was just a combination of taking what I found exotic and exciting and marrying that to the things that I thought were strengths about where I'm from.
Excellent. So, audience questions, yeah. So, has anybody in the audience got any questions that they would like to ask Chris?
Hello. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed. I love the insights you have and the way that you weave them all out almost into a story. My question is that I took to writing my life story, and it was set in Rutherglen. It was focused very much on Rutherglen. And when I put it out to 2 people to sort of say, well, what do you think? They said, is that the James Joyce School of Writing? Because I digressed so much that I never came back to where I started. How do you organise your material? You said earlier on, I'll see where it goes. Do you have a strategy for organising the information? Because your books are quite cleverly sort of interwoven. How does that work?
I think I'm influenced a lot by cinema. I think I realised years ago, Marissa was looking at books on screenwriting, And she showed me this book called Story Maps by Daniel Calvisi, and it's quite a short book, but really helpful, because it's about how there's a certain structure to just about every successful film, and I realised that I'd never actually formally read about this, but I'd been doing it by instinct all my life. And it's not just that I'd somehow instinctively developed this, is that we all kind of understand story in a certain way, and if the story doesn't follow those rules, you get confused by it, or it doesn't feel satisfying. So I know I say I see where the idea takes me. That's maybe on a daily basis, what's going to happen in one scene, or something that might take the character in an unexpected direction. But overall, I think it's a bit like telling a joke, in that you need to know the punchline before you work on how you're going to misdirect everybody so that the punchline lands. So I always know what's going to be revealed at the end. And in a way, it's like starting at the end is quite crucial, because for one thing, you know where it is you're trying to get to. It would drive Marissa mad though, because we'd know where we started, and we'd know where we're getting to later on, and then she'd say, but how are we going to get from that to that? And I'd say, I don't know yet. And she doesn't like that as an answer, but I'd say, look, sometimes you have to spend time with your characters and see what works, see where do those characters take you, because I think if you plan too much, it can feel like the character's on rails. You've already decided what will happen to them. And certainly in a
wall of post-its then, of all the different strands, a whole wall of
post-its.
Who's a character and what, do you have that, how do you keep it in your head?
I don't know how I keep it in my head. It's like the world's most complex equation, and you can only see a wee bit of it at a time, but every time you solve a wee bit, I always feel really happy, but then you realise what you've done is just open the door to another massive area that you don't know. But working together, Marissa and I have, partly because when we were doing the TV adaptation, that was all about structure, and it's about taking the parts, taking everything apart and putting them back together again. And we have got a whiteboard and not post-its, it's like index cards and magnets and different coloured cards depending on, well, that's for that character strand or that's for that, and it does look a bit like a serial killer's wall after a while, but at the same time, that's television and film is very much about structure, and novels, I think crime novels, it's helpful for it to be about structure, but not every novel requires that structure. There's a rambling element to it that the Joycean element is perhaps appropriate to some books. I mean, my favourite Scottish novel is Swing, Hammer, Swing by Jeff Torrington, and that's literally rambling, because the character's just rambling around the Gorbals for about 300 pages. And Jeff Torrington famously said, plots are for symmetries. So there's not really a plot to it. But if you take it apart and look at it from a certain perspective, you do see that it maps to this story map structure. There's often a kind of equilibrium at the beginning, which starts to fall apart, and then by the end, the character essentially has to have changed. And so these are the things that you do instinctively when you're trying to tell a story. But in novels, certainly, I think there's less of a need to be disciplined, and I think that's something that always excites me, that you can be inspired by something that on one morning that you didn't know was in your head the day before.
Any others?
Hi, Chris. When you're writing a new novel, I suppose I've got two parts to this question. Do you still handwrite down your ideas and things, or do you type on? Do you put it on a laptop, or do you prefer the kind of handwritten method still?
I don't write much by hand anymore. I used to scribble ideas down, yeah. But in recent years, I came to dictate a lot of stuff to myself. The smartphone allows me to, if I'm out walking, that's how I do most of my writing, is I go walks and I just dictate to myself. And it used to be ideas, then it became more and more specific. I'll work out roughly what a character's thinking to himself, and sometimes the dialogue, then I'll get back to the house and transcribe that and then try and tidy it up or elaborate on the ideas that I've come up with. So now if I have an idea, I will generally just dictate it into my phone, but I'll make sure I transcribe it and make sure it's on a document somewhere.
I think the other question I had is, when you're writing about crime, serial killers, murderers, does it affect your dreams at night? Do you sleep well at night when you're writing such horrific things during a novel?
We were talking there about bloody Scotland, and crime writers we're generally very cheerful and well-balanced people, and I think it's maybe that we get so many of the dark sort of conflicting ideas onto the page. I'm generally not really disturbed by the material that I'm writing. In a way, it's like the same way as I don't make myself laugh writing anything. If I'm trying to write something funny, because it's like you can't tickle yourself, so it's like you can't really disturb yourself with your own thoughts. Mm-hmm. What I will find though is sometimes if you're writing an awful lot from the point of view of a character that's in a bad place or has a really dark perspective, that can start to get at your head. Mm-hmm. And you have to. I mean, writing the Cliff House, there's 7 different women's perspectives, and I had to write and think about what's each one of them like, how did she view the world, and stay in that woman's head until the next chapter. And if you're doing that, that's fine if it's a fairly well-balanced character, but I've written novels where I have been writing from the point of view of someone who's got a very warped perspective, and you realise that it's going through your head. Not at night, just like daytime, you suddenly have a really unkind thought. I think, oh, that's Simon Darcourt in my head. You know.
Hiya. I wanted to ask, I write children's stories, and my sister's got 6 grandchildren, that's how it started, but quite a lot of people now ask me how they buy them, how they get them, and I don't have a clue, because I've just got the stories and I end up getting really embarrassed about it, because I don't know, do I stop writing stories, something I really enjoy, or do I try and push it and follow it and find out how I take it further?
Mm-hmm. I guess that's up to you. Are you happy just with what you've created and the process of creation, or do you? I mean, I think it's a really important part is to feel that your work has meant something to somebody else. I mean, when I've written a book, there's a period when nobody's read it, because it's finished, but I've sent it to even before I send it to my editor. I've often written it and then I need to polish it up before I can show it to anybody. And it's this weird feeling that I know I've poured my heart and soul into something and it doesn't exist until somebody else has experienced it. So, I guess if you're happy enough, you're motivated to show it to a few people and a few children want to experience that. But I mean, some people it's all about putting it out there into the world, and some people write because writing helps them.
I would say it's probably taking more of the lead itself than I have, because people are asking me to write stories for their children, because the ones that I write are personalised. Mm-hmm. So the ones that I've written for my own nieces and nephews, I wouldn't give out. But because of that, people are more interested, and so they want me to write for them. But as I say, I've got no illustration, I've got nothing, and I actually came here tonight to ask you that question. Right. How do I take it forward?
I don't know. It sounds very bespoke as well. So I don't have a great insight into the sort of publishing side of things, because I'm tend to be quite remote from that. I send my book off to somebody, and so it's not an area that I get to deal with very often.
What general advice would you give then to budding authors?
The one that worked for me, which is always write what you enjoy. Don't make the mistake of writing what you think a publisher wants to publish. It's always write what you are interested in, write what you love. Create vehicles for your passions. That's something I've been doing all my career, is like, if there's something I want to write about, I'll try and find a story that allows me to do that. Because you can always tell, a book always kind of sparks off the page if you're getting a sense of the author's enthusiasm for their subject. And I think if you're writing personalised stories, there's going to be that spark there, because for one thing, the reader's going to be interested in because they've got a direct connection. But I think certainly the advice I always give is you write about the thing you love, And that can include something you love to hate. You know, that can include the thing that's annoying you, because that worked for me for several books. I wrote books that were satirising things that I found absurd or crying out to be mocked.
We've got a couple of questions that have been posted on our YouTube chat. I'm just going to share that with you if that's okay. We've got one question here from Healthy and Happy. Can we ask Chris if there are any superstitious or odd habits, I guess routines, that you might go through whilst you're writing?
Certainly not superstitions, but really just as I was saying there, I walk. You know, I can't write if I can't walk. So when the weather's terrible, I look like a deep sea fisherman, you know, because I have to be. I'd rather be out in terrible weather getting work done than stuck in the house staring at the rain. So no matter what the weather, I'll wrap up and get out there. And the only danger is I'm walking about Bothwell talking about how to get rid of a body. And you know, and you just got to watch who overhears that.
Great. And there's one other question from Alex Gibson, who posted, would you ever write a novel in different genres, such as science fiction or, what does it say? Scroll down a bit for me. All right. Well, would you consider writing in other genres, such as science fiction?
I have. I've written.
Now you know, Alex.
Technically 3 science fiction novels. A novel Pandemonium, which is a horror story, but it's science fiction, and Bedlam, which is also a video game. It was a combination. I developed a video game with a company and wrote the novel. But then 2017 I published a novel called Places in the Darkness, which is a crime story set aboard a space station.
Oh, it's back to me. All right, okay. So why do you feel so passionate about telling stories? What makes you get up every day and sit down and start writing your book?
Do you know it's just that? It's that passion to tell stories. You know, I think it's not as simple as a passion to express myself. I think it's a hard question to answer, because it's just a drive that comes within myself. When I experience something, I'm thinking, how do I render that in narrative? How could I use that and tell a story? And also, I think there's probably a kind of showing off element to it as well, of wanting to see what people make of it, you know, creating an experience that people respond to. And I think growing up, I was as much inspired by stand-up comedians as I was by the books I was reading. So that a kind of narrative style developed that's conversational and that's comes from that kind of stand-up idiom. So that's always there. I think whatever happens, I want to some extent, it's about making sense of the world. You know, the great thing about stories is that they do take the world and render it in a way that we can digest. That, whether that's the structure of it or just that it's something that has a beginning, a middle and an end, because most of the time life doesn't. Most of the time life is just too confusing. So I think a lot of it comes from me looking at the world around me and thinking, right, how do I render that in a form that makes some kind of sense?
And of course you're a St Mirren fan, so football seems to...
There's no need to go there.
Well, you seem to wedge football into every book.
I do put the odd reference in. My wife ensures I'm not self-indulgent about that, which just keeps reminding me that not everybody's interested. So what I tend to do is try and put in references so that if you get the reference, fine. If you don't, you won't think, oh, I'm missing something there.
And of course, we have to ask you about Glastonbury, because, you know, Chris has been on Glastonbury, haven't you? You've been playing at Glastonbury, you and Chris Martin.
It's one of the strangest and the greatest perk of the job is that back in about 2017, a group of crime writers decided to form a band, called ourselves the Fun-Loving Crime Writers. And it started as a joke, really. There was Mark Billingham, Stuart Neville and Doug Johnston. They were at a kind of convention in New Orleans, and there was a kind of open mic night, and they sort of shambled their way through a few songs, and it was on YouTube. And so the Edinburgh Book Festival said, well, they had a late night strand during the festival, said, could you guys maybe put together some material and do a show? And the slot was like 2 hours. It was like 90 minutes, or 2 45 minutes with an interval. So we thought, well, they better recruit some more members and learn some more songs. So to that, they added Val McDermott, Luca Vesti, and myself. So we started playing at the Edinburgh Book Festival, ended up playing a few other festivals. Well, I think in 2018 we ended up playing about 13 festivals. And then in 2019 we get invited to play Glastonbury. So we which to this day I still can't believe happened.
I was just going to say, you and Lewis Capaldi must be best pals now.
Well, we played in what was called the acoustic tent, or the acoustic stage, even though it's not acoustic music. But one of the acts on, I think the act on either immediately after us or a wee bit after us was Marty Pello. And there was a great moment where we went to the kind of catering area and we're in the queue, and Stuart Neville's wife wanted Marty Pello's autograph, so Stuart was like trying to pluck up the courage to go and bother Marty Pello. But Marty Pello, meantime, it turned out was plucking up the courage to go and bother Val McDermott, because he was a huge fan of Val McDermott.
That must be really good. Great. Yep, well, was that to wrap up? Yep. So again, we would like to thank the Year of Stories 2022 Community Stories Fund for helping for tonight's event to occur. The fund is being delivered in partnership by Visit Scotland, Museums, Galleries Scotland, with support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, with thanks to the National Lottery players. They are also supported by Scottish Book Trust Live Literature Programme funding. Our next authors event is on Friday the 4th of November, where we will be welcoming Lisa Gray. Please do hit the subscribe button and the Healthy and Happy Trust YouTube channel so you don't miss out. My thanks again to Christopher Brookmyre and to you, our lovely audience. Thank you so much. And just a couple of community announcements. We've got the community cinema screening of Respect is on the 21st of October at 6:30. There's a cookery demonstration at 5:30.